Synapse series. The series went into lockdown between February and May, but has delivered a very full program over the rest of the year. And that's due in no small part both to Beth and to Sarah McLaughlin, who was our events officer and has just recently picked up a fabulous job at in the APS. So we no longer have her with us, unfortunately. I'll start, as we always do, by acknowledging and celebrating the Ngunnawal people on whose unceded traditional lands those of us who are in Canberra live and are meeting today, and pay our respect to the community's elders and leaders, past, present, and emerging. We're delighted to have as our speaker today an ANU colleague, Cate Frieman. Cate was trained at Yale and Oxford and was most recently a lecturer in archaeology at the University of Nottingham, before joining us in Canberra as an associate professor in European archaeology in the School of Archaeology and Anthropology. Cate's DPhil at Oxford focused on the adoption of metal objects and metallurgy in Northwest Europe from the 4th to the 2nd millennium BC, but she came at this rather indirectly by looking at stone artifacts that had been assumed to be skeuomorphs, or imitations of metal. She remains a material culture and technology specialist with a particular focus on stone tools, but her theoretical interests range much more broadly and currently center on questions of innovation and conservatism. Her new book, An Archaeology of Innovation, Approaching Social and Technological Change in Human Society, is just out through Manchester University Press, and it looks great, very firmly within the remit of our Evolution of Cultural Diversity initiative, as it addresses the wider social embeddedness of innovations in technology, while also considering the role of conservatism to explain how and why some innovations come to be rejected. So her talk today, Innovation as Process, a Social Anthropological Approach, Archaeological Approach, picks up on some of the core themes of her book, and I'm looking forward to it very much. Cate, the virtual floor is all yours.
Thanks, Chris. All right, let me get this presentation up. And thanks for the great introduction. Okay. Thank you very much for the introduction, Chris, and thanks for mentioning the skeuomorphism, because I actually wanted to start there. When Beth asked for a photo, I immediately reached for a flint dagger because they've been a favorite thing of mine since I was about 19 years old, and I keep coming back to flint daggers. And I thought I would, as part of this discussion of innovation as a process, explain a bit my own kind of intellectual history about how I got to digging into innovation. I should also say this is the first time I've tried to kind of condense the book into a presentation, so I hope it goes well, and friendly critical feedback is definitely welcome. So as Chris noted, I started my research looking at skeuomorphism, which after a lot of work, I kind of came to a definition of a meaningful imitation in one material of an object made in another. And amongst the materials I looked at that were thought to be skeuomorphs were these beautiful flint daggers. There are a lot of flint daggers from Europe. There are tens of thousands of them. They date between the 4th and the 2nd millennia BC, and they often show up around the same time as metal. And this particular type of flint dagger, known as a fishtail flint dagger, dates to the early 2nd millennium BC and is found in southern Scandinavia primarily. That's where they were made. And they're often called imitations of contemporary metal daggers, these early Bronze Age copper and copper alloy daggers, on the basis of formal similarities. This kind of leaf-shaped blade, the inward curve towards the handle, the outward fishtail-shaped pommel, and this very fine napping or punched napping on the handles that's referred to as stitching, because it's thought to imitate the stitching on what would have been an organic handle. And I wanted to investigate this idea of imitation and actually do a kind of close study of the objects. And as I was kind of digging into the concept of skeuomorphism, I realized that it had a lot of secrets within it. It was a black box of a term. And a lot of the work that I did as a PhD student and in subsequent publications was to explode the idea of skeuomorphism. And some of that was to dig into the various ways skeuomorphs were understood and skeuomorphism was understood. And I'm going to kind of rush through this. The point is not that any of these is correct, but that each of these has its own assumptions of what skeuomorphism, or this meaningful imitation, was doing. So it is a part of many models around technological evolution. These are ideas around vestigial, and this is the origin point of the concept of skeuomorphism, that imitation in materials is vestigial, functionless, no meaningful content, and it's a product of material and technological advance. We have ideas around cultural conservatism, that is, that people were uncomfortable with change and so continued to make things that looked like the stuff they liked in new materials to kind of domesticate the new materials or to make them acceptable. Again, this embeds kind of quite concrete ideas of progress as well, and keep this in mind as the idea that people in the past were essentially conservative, that change was non-normative. Slightly differently, more recent, there's been ideas around imitation and economics, around the idea that skeuomorphs like plastic versions of woven baskets, for example, are low-value materials and low-value copies of high-value objects. You see this in a lot of work around the early Bronze Age in the Aegean, where there are discussions about people copying in ceramic vessels that would have been made in silver or other high-value metals. There is a long-standing link between, and this comes through the others, between this idea of skeuomorphism and technological innovation as well, with the idea that imitations are part of that process, that they are perhaps subverting dominant values, or it's a way of, again, domesticating or newly valuing new materials, or perhaps that prototypes and imitations have something to do with that kind of switch to a new material. And this, for example, is why lots of people think there are so many skeuomorphs, these meaningful imitations, around times like the introduction of metal. Slightly more abstractly, there's a long-running world in kind of anthropology of looking at imitation as a material metaphor. This is work heavily influenced by Tausig's work on mimesis, for example, that the skeuomorph links the object to a larger conceptual world. What's interesting to me about this is that this is one of the few ways of understanding skeuomorphism that links the object and the gestures of production, which I think is a very important linkage to make, because things don't exist separate from the making of things, particularly in small scale and non-capitalist frameworks. And there's also a kind of slightly lighter and in some ways less complex idea of imitation as part of play or toy. These are miniatures, they're children's tools. Maybe they're objects that are produced through or used in teaching and learning. There's also a kind of post-colonial interpretation here that says that, for example, colonized people may have been making imitations of their own material for the market, not just as part of engaging in capitalist economies, but as a way of subverting some of that power and redirecting some of that colonial power in their communities. So this is all the kind of idea around skeuomorphism. Unfortunately, that doesn't necessarily play out when you look at the daggers themselves. A lot of this is about the formal similarity, the final forms of the two objects look alike. But being a technology specialist and being a stone tool specialist, I was very interested in how these were produced. And when I looked into the production processes of flint daggers, what I found is that they weren't in any way anything to do with metal. They were reproducing earlier and contemporary forms of axes. The stitching on the handles is a stylized version of the corners of these square-butted, thick-butted axes that are very common in Scandinavian prehistory for about 1,000 years before the flint daggers come in. And the way that they're being made is a really interesting play on the form of these axes, because the axes are pretty straightforward to make and they would have been a very well-known object type. But the flint daggers look the same when they're done. They have that same kind of finish and angle to them. They have these same sort of punched corners. But they're made ever so slightly differently. I don't want to get into the details particularly, but we do have lots of excavation evidence that suggests that those finishing details were being done in secret, or at least away from settlements. So people would have seen the flint dagger start to be produced, and then the finishing touches, including that stitching or the zigzag scars, would have been done secretly, and then it would have come out. And instead of looking like a square-butted axe with 4 right angles, it looked like a dagger with a triangular end or a lozenge-shaped end. And there's a certain amount of tricksy play going on here. That's tricksy play about stone tools and stone technologies, and nothing at all to do with metal tools and metal technologies. And that got me wondering, are they actually imitating metal at all? Is this something that we've just made up as archaeologists? And if so, kind of why? I'm sorry, I leave that behind. So when we get into this larger concept, one of the things that got me thinking about was actually, what is the point of daggers at all? What are they doing in society? Why do they appear? Not just why do flint ones appear and why do metal ones appear, but why do daggers appear at all? So in seeking to understand what was happening with flint and metal daggers in this period of the earliest Metal Ages, I leaned heavily on one of my supervisors, Helen von Kielde's concept of a dagger idea in late Neolithic Europe, which she linked both to the spread of early metals and to specific ideas around status and masculinity, perhaps linked to martial behavior. Volker Hyde, another European archaeologist, also noted the development of daggers and their association with emerging patterns of long-distance movement of ideas and valued raw materials, including metal. So the fourth and third millennia see a huge extension in long-distance trade and communication. People want to be in touch, and they want to be in touch more distantly. And they want objects and materials that are from far away. This is more than just flint and more than just metal. But that can be deployed in deeply local contexts and relationships. So these objects are foreign, but they're also local. They're domesticated locally. And lithic daggers work perfectly in this world. So in this previous work, I suggested that the novel dagger form, which has no real antecedent in European material culture, allowed it to materialize a whole set of further values. In particular, I've suggested that carrying, using, and displaying a dagger was part of a wider set of ideas involving a particular openness to innovation, and it formed part of a shared material vocabulary which minimized the social and cultural difference between distant communities. In other words, daggers were boundary objects, things that bridge multiple symbolic worlds and maintain their own identity, intellectual meeting points between cultures, technologies, materials, and local interest versus regional or global trends. Innovation and this kind of concept of technological change has long been a topic in archaeology. There are many edited volumes that discuss it, though largely these focus on questions of technological rather than social innovations. And many of them, interestingly, have a very strong European focus. Most of this literature engages with the social science around innovation studies, though a sizable minority uses evolutionary or Darwinian models to approach innovation. I want to give a quick shout out to Robin Torrance, who I saw showed up for this talk. Her edited volume, What's New with Sander van der Loo, published in the 1980s, is an absolute classic and has been incredibly inspiring to me as a researcher developing my own ideas in this space. So thank you, Robin. Anyhow, despite the different methodologies of these approaches, both types of archaeological innovation studies have deep roots in the discipline, but I'd argue a relatively narrow and interpretively thin understanding of innovation and how it works. So I'm going to do a little bit of background on technological change and innovation in archaeological. This is extremely spotty and extremely not comprehensive. Chronology and technological change have long been married in our models of the past. 19th century evolutionary paradigms married them in ways still embedded in our thinking. So technology, like species and social organization, was believed to become more sophisticated and complex over time. The stone, bronze, iron sequence was not just observable, it was rational, expected, and inescapable. Early anthropologists like Tyler and Morgan used these models to compare, and I will say compare in an extremely racist fashion, indigenous and non-European people, their technologies and ways of life, with the ancient peoples of Europe whose stone axes and bronze sword filled the glass cases of museums. They proposed models of social evolution that effectively ranked social organizations, ancient and modern, from most simple, in this case lower savagery, to least simple, or civilization, where civilization looks suspiciously like Victorian England. These stages weren't just based on political structure or social organization, but subsistence practices and levels of technological innovation. In these models, we see an obvious significance, not just of new raw materials, but of specific technological practices. They're premised on the idea that certain tools or technosystems, like forms of agriculture, are a direct proxy for social organization, and changes in these can be directly correlated both to social changes and to chronological changes. By the early 20th century, enough data had been accumulated that archaeologists could identify chronologically and regionally bound groups of similar types of material culture into entities called cultures, which were thought more or less to represent bounded ethnic groups. Developing sequences of archaeological cultures was referred to as culture history and was seen essentially as creating a historical sequence with knowable or at least identifiable people in the past. This example is Gordon Child's quite famous schema of the cultural sequence for the Neolithic and Bronze Age in Central and Eastern Europe. And in this model, not only were the cultures understood to be bounded in ways that don't really align with contemporary ideas about identity, they were also supposed to be deeply conservative, resistant and opposed to change. Innovation, when it happened, remained synonymous with culture change and was thought to derive almost entirely from the movement of new people into an area, either through peaceful migration or through violent invasion. In Child's models in particular, innovation was of crucial importance. Child was a committed Marxist and developed his culture histories around Marxian concepts, including the core idea that technological developments prefigure social change and modes of production determine cultural superstructure. His model of the agricultural revolution remains influential to this day. That is the idea that agriculture represents a meaningful step up in social and political complexity, one which totally refigures social and political organization. And this is quite widely recognized, not just within archaeology, where it's much more debated, but actually the public, where this is kind of diffused outwards. Keep that maybe in mind slightly. Evolutionary approaches to innovation never quite disappeared, although they've kind of become very much their own thing. And they've received particular attention in archaeology since the 1980s. Much of this work is strongly influenced by ecological modeling and demographic factors, as well as demographic factors and environmental constraints play a large role in the preferred explanatory frameworks. In this case, Henrich argues that without a large enough population, skills and knowledge will be lost and maladaptation becomes likely. He illustrates this for what it's worth, and I think in quite a problematic fashion, through an extended rehashing of Rhys Jones's quite controversial and long disproved ideas about Aboriginal Tasmanian technology and society. I would point out this was published in 2004, which isn't recent, but is still recent enough that he should have known better than to lean so heavily on Rhys Jones. There are a number of reasons that I avoid evolutionary approaches or minimize them in my own work, but chief amongst them is that from my perspective, having read this, and I know that that's not universally shared, evolutionary and Darwinian archaeologies and models of change remove power, complexity, and historicity from our understanding of human practice, replacing these with mechanistic or even animalistic conceptions of behavior, in which technology, society, and the environment are largely disaggregated, except where one acts as a constraint on the other. I come at this from a social archaeological point of view, which amongst other things sees technology as social, as well as kind of environmental elements. So people are constantly embedded and enmeshed in their environment, and technology and human society can't be disentangled. They happen together and affect each other and are part of the same series of practices and relations. Beyond archaeology, innovation has also been the subject of intense research in the social sciences. And this goes through for decades and decades. Here, for example, is Everett Rogers' famous S-curve of innovation, which charts the innovation process over time, showing the slow process of innovation adoption. This has been invoked over the years by historians, economists, anthropologists, sociologists, and archaeologists, though because the archaeological record is fragmented and incomplete, I would say we generally lack evidence for those earliest stages of innovation adoption. By the time we're finding our firsts and our oldests, I would guess in almost every case, the technology or the material is reasonably diffused into the population. Following Rogers' model, through contact with early adopters, people become aware of a new practice, thing, or idea. They seek information about it, they test it for advantages and disadvantages, they try it out, and finally they adopt it fully into their day-to-day lives. In this way, the act of accepting an innovation is not a passive one, and the innovation itself is altered by its slow incorporation into a new social structure. Innovations are also regularly rejected. And this is something that I find very, very interesting, and I'll come back to towards the end of this talk. Not just on functional grounds, but for arbitrary reasons that are difficult to assess. And these are often grounded very firmly in cultural attitudes towards the new altered practices, technologies, or ideas, or the people who are sharing them. Moving more recently, if we look at social models of human technology systems developed within the history of science and STS, we can frame innovations as multiply constructed by various constituencies, individuals, groups, market forces, social categories of use or value, etc. Each of which has different problems or needs which they see the technology as addressing. And various solutions to each of these problems is available. These are technological, but also social or legal. Pinch and Beaker famously modeled this with the development of the so-called safety bicycle. That's the bicycle we all ride today. On this slide is the traditional linear model of bicycle development, which draws lines of direct familial connection between forms of the bicycle that appear post hoc to have generated subsequent forms. But while this works on paper, I don't think it really matches reality. For example, the Lawson's bicyclette, widely understood to be a precursor of the safety bicycle, was a commercial failure. The bicycle itself in their model means different things to different groups. So early cycling enthusiasts wanted different things out of a bicycle, thought of bicycles differently than anti-cyclists, people who jeered cyclists and threw stones at them. And if you've ever cycled in a city, those people are still very much present. The form of the bicycle itself similarly responds to problems posed to the object by different groups. Daring men wanting to ride high wheelers very fast had very different problems and expectations to women who were socially required to wear skirts and so unable to ride similarly high-wheeled bicycles, but still wanted to ride some sort of bicycle. Those tensions shaped the forms of the bicycle, and the negotiation shaped it. And we see emerging social and technological solutions develop which allow consensus to be formed. In this case, lower wheeled bicycles that women can ride in skirts, but also changing social mores, which led to more acceptance for women wearing trousers and bloomers. So the model of technological innovation is better understood as a messy mishmash of illogical, socially significant problems and solutions alongside technical and technological developments. Major social categories such as gender and the political and social worlds in which these are negotiated are as significant as, or perhaps even more significant than, apparent technological functionality, or the opinions and decisions of single inventors or entrepreneurs. Put in more contemporary terms, and this is drawn from kind of a modern review paper from sociology, innovations emerge from enmeshed and entangled networks of people, things, places, larger social structures, and the relationships between and among all of these. So, if we want to understand innovation, it's not enough to understand a technology and its value or its function. It's not enough to understand a social structure. It's not enough to understand the environment. All of these things are constantly feeding into each other and shaping the trajectory of technology. This is what's meant by innovation as process. This process is complicated and messy and multiply authored and highly socially contingent. But that is not really how we have historically discussed innovation in archaeology. This, in fact, is how we tend to visualize change over time in archaeology. In this case, we're looking at the spread of metal in prehistoric Eurasia. The maps are Roberts and colleagues' parsimonious model, which posits a single point of invention for copper metallurgy and a process of more or less smooth diffusion outwards from there, as people migrated or learned about the technology from their neighbors. This is a model that would have been very comfortable for Gordon Childe to have worked with in the 1950s. And Ben Roberts, the lead author, is a friend of mine, and I have told him that repeatedly, and he seems okay with it. More recent metallurgical work by Miljana Radovojevich suggests that this was not as smooth a process. She's identified, and this is in line with earlier hypotheses from Colin Renfrew and others, a hearth of inventive metallurgy in southeastern Europe, where a polymetallic tradition emerged that not only included early and possibly the earliest gold metallurgy, but experimentation with a variety of ores and possible ores. Amongst her finds is a bit of slag, and it's on this slide somewhere. suggesting that tin bronze may have been produced in parts of Southeast Europe in the 5th millennium BC. And this is 3,000 years before you find tin bronze anywhere in the world. Instead of suggesting this to have been part of a directed process of experimentation and technological development, Radovojevic sees this as the product of a metallurgy that required green and black stones to use as ore. Many locally available green and black stones could be smelted into copper. Many of them were. Some of these weren't ores and would have failed when people attempted to smelt them. Others were natural alloys of tin and copper. So you can see this is a kind of anti-linear process. The human experiment, the way that people conceptualize the metal itself, isn't in that sense of a technology that we iterate on. It's in a sense of a material that we do the right rites, we do the right fire, we probably sing the right songs. And if we're lucky and the gods are happy and the right person has done it and they've done the right ceremony before, the result is metal. Radovojevic thinks they probably didn't realize they'd made bronze versus copper, and that seems very likely. Maybe it was just a slightly different color. A similar parsimonious model has long held sway for early agriculture studies and remains very much part of our current discourse. And that would be Price's model up top. 8 or 9 places where agriculture was invented and everything else spread outwards from there. But increasing work in archaeobotany demonstrates not only that there were more hearths of early cultivation than previous archaeologists have appreciated, but that experiments with cultivation were neither rare or geographically isolated. While only some plants went on to be widely adopted as cultivars, many regions show a mosaic of practices in the gray space between fully agricultural and non-agricultural. This is cultivation in fits and starts, experiments which started but are usually abandoned. Again, this is an anti-linear, anti-progressive model, but one that really brings to the foreground the amount of creativity and manipulation of the environment that people in the past were engaged in. In a way to kind of visualize this, I quite like my colleague Tim Denham's model of agricultural innovation in New Guinea. In order to step away from the binary of domestic wild or agriculturalist forager, he tried to unbundle these socio-technological economic categories into, amongst other things, bodily gestures and practices. This allowed him to see not just the innovations in practices, but also continuities masked by our contemporary view of innovation as a paradigm-shifting change. And I love this diagram as well. It's kind of deeply silly and quite different from anything else anyone else has been making. At this point, I want to turn and start actually looking at that question of continuity, because it's something that I think we really struggle with in archaeology, but actually we can have, I think, potentially a really big impact by focusing on it. In the contemporary societies studied by sociologists and anthropologists, it's generally easy to identify innovation rejection, continuity of tradition, and technological conservatism. Archaeological insight into these sorts of individualized decisions and small-scale, short-lived adoption processes is more limited because our material is so fragmented. As the archaeological record is necessarily incomplete, in attempting to identify episodes of resistance, we're faced with the classic absence of evidence paradox. That is, are we not finding traces of a thing in a given area at a given time because the people living there and then did not have or want it? Or are we not finding those traces because they weren't deposited in ways that are archaeologically visible? Or they existed in such minimal quantities that they're likely unrecoverable without a real stroke of luck. They may have been decayed or otherwise destroyed over time due to taphonomic or anthropogenic processes, etc. There's all sorts of ways the archaeological record is incomplete. There remains a long-standing tendency to assume conservatism to have been the status quo, leaving the occasional innovation as the only phenomenon to observe. Past people are imagined as being suspicious of new ideas and resistant to change. Of particular concern is that these models implicitly reproduce colonialist frameworks in which specific societies, often Eurasian, with the trappings of civilization, so literacy, civic architecture, complex political economies, etc., are innovative and technologically advanced, while the less complex, and thus less civilized, societies on their fringes are conservative adopters of others' innovations rather than inventors or creators of their own. Certainly following Montonsubias and Hernando, two historians and historical archaeologists, The historical and archaeological discourse privileges change, both social and technological, over continuity because of its origins in a particularly Eurocentric and masculine strand of Enlightenment thinking, in which change and progress are the hallmarks of civilization. This discourse, developed within the context of European colonial expansion, explicitly positioned dynamic European societies as more advanced, more valuable, and more moral than unchanging, stable, or backwards non-European societies, the very ones which became our models for what past societies might have been like. And Montonsubias and Hernando build from this point to argue that we should be developing an archaeology of maintenance activities, those activities and practices which contribute to cultural continuity and cultural preservation. A first step for me in understanding continuity is recognizing that it, like innovation, is neither simple nor unitary. It's also a black box that we can explode. Different people may be conservative in different ways. In some places and times, we might see the regular rejection or resistance to specific social practices, while new technologies are welcomed avidly. And in others, both new social and technological practices might be outright rejected. Moreover, if we accept social constructivist models of technology, then continuity, non-innovation, or innovation failure are actually a regular feature of the development of any new technology. But the successful adoption of a given innovation conceals the many points at which elements failed to be adopted or were outright rejected. And this is where you should be thinking about that bicycle diagram, where a very complex, messy series of negotiations is compressed into a linear heritage through the process of stabilization and consensus. Rejection itself is perhaps best understood as both complicated and inextricably entwined with social factors, including kinship, cosmology, and the balance of power between competing individuals or groups. In the contemporary world, we can observe this dynamic in practice amongst communities who intentionally limit their contact with modern technologies and society. Whilst popular portrayals of these communities focus on their old-fashioned attire, horse-drawn vehicles, and perceived opposition to technological progress, actually, these are the result of a series of ongoing negotiations about social values, community connectedness, and the maintenance of tradition. Lindsay Ems found that Amish workers who contracted out for labor found themselves in need of a telephone, both to liaise with clients and to communicate with each other from far-flung work sites. But mobile phones were considered to be too disruptive. Instead, landline phones were retrofitted with attachments to interface with the cellular network and to be powered by a car cigarette lighter. These were placed in plywood boxes so that they could be transported out to work sites by construction crews, but would remain inconvenient for personal use. Instead, the one phone is shared by the whole work crew and remains with the vehicles and equipment, a highly innovative way of resisting the pressure to carry individual mobile phones. Resistance to innovation, when we discuss it in archaeology, has mostly been studied through histories of contact and colonialism. These studies demonstrate, alongside kind of copious anthropological work in this kind of post-colonial context, that instead of the product of backwards people, indigenous resistance to colonial materials and technologies is better characterized as ambivalent and ambiguous. Where we see a clear rejection of exogenous materials and technologies, this often postdates a phase of experimentation with or tolerance of the new items. Anthropologist Lepowski makes clear that this form of resistance is both knowing and nuanced, and sees the idea of traditional culture and materials being cannily manipulated by knowledgeable social actors in order to maintain an effective check on colonialist cultural hegemony, rather than recreate an unaltered pre-contact reality. Bayman offers an archaeological example of this by examining the extremely slow penetration of iron axes into the toolkits of native Hawaiian peoples. He argues that this reflects an adoption process mediated by the pre-existing power structures, as the elite class made use of European materials and practices to enforce their distinctions from Hawaiian commoner classes. Due to their close control of the spread of iron tools, these were not rapidly adopted by commoners who continued using stone axes into the early 20th century. Building on First Nations critiques, American archaeologist Lee Panic suggests that decolonizing our ideas about innovation and conservatism means reframing narratives of contact and colonialism as persistence narratives. In other words, by focusing on European innovations and how First Nations people responded to them, our research implicitly equates change with loss of culture. Instead, he argues that we should look at the vibrancy and flexibility of First Nations traditions and their ability to encompass new materials, technologies, and ways of life and power dynamics, so that First Nations people were able to persist and continue to develop a vibrant and living culture. Even beyond the highly fraught power struggles of hegemonic dominance and colonialism, resistance and innovative activities can be understood as playing dynamic roles within the process of innovation adoption. So coming out of the world of organizational studies, Bauer suggests that resistance functions to open or reopen debate. It slows or prevents the processes of stabilization and closure and provides alternative options to apparently successful innovations or trajectories of social and technological development. Tradition is often framed as something static, which stands in the way of, or perhaps even in the face of, progress, in the form of new practices, technologies, and ways of life. But to borrow a turn of phrase from Marilyn Strathern, the idea of tradition and the idea of innovation both enfold many complex concepts, although in the English language at least, they do not adhere to each other very well. By contrast, and building on decades of anthropological and literary research, we could reframe our idea of tradition as a process itself, and one that involves continual recreation. Tradition then is both a frame through which and a tool with which to position social acts in dialogue with the past, with the wider context in which one is acting, with other people, both those who are members of the actors' community and those who aren't, and with the future. In other words, it's a dynamic, malleable, and highly reactive process in its own right. Indeed, acts of resistance or the reinvigoration or maintenance of tradition typically entail a deeply creative praxis and include and enfold myriad innovations in their own right. Moreover, innovation and change can also be deeply conservative in nature, hearkening back to earlier practices and outdated technologies. Ask me my opinions about Uber in the questions. Archaeology is a niche discipline with little influence on contemporary debates outside of a very few, very narrow domains. But I contend that we're actually perfectly positioned to push back on common wisdom and develop new models of social practice that very strongly relate to present concerns. The innovation discourse is profoundly compromised by having been developed within an explicitly capitalist and colonialist framework, and having been deployed in ways that promote and universalize that frame, giving it a false history and a false lineage. Moreover, the impulse to disaggregate technology from society, and both of these from the complex flows of power that characterize people's relations with each other and with the wider other than human world, is a huge flaw in our understandings of how innovation operates. Even histories of technology tend towards teleological frameworks. How did our present technosystems derive from past technologies, with failures, experiments, and underdeveloped alternatives being largely neglected or relegated to studies of historical oddities? Archaeology, by contrast, cannot be teleological. Our record is fragmented, and there's rarely a clear line between then and now. We're forced to work with whatever data we have, to consider each fragment in constructing our stories, and to keep space for alternative reinterpretations if new data or methods emerge. Our stories of innovation can be, though not all of them are, flexible, complicated, messy, and incomplete. We're already conditioned to see technology as a reflection of society and to see both as profoundly influenced by and influencing the natural environment. And we're comfortable with multiple narratives that only partially overlap. Most of the people we study lived before the emergence of global capitalism, so we are free to disregard capitalist ontologies and theories of power in attempting to understand their own internal logics. Rogers detailed the process of innovation over 50 years ago as part of his pioneering research into diffusion. What archaeologists are uniquely positioned to do is historicize this process, complicate it, and make it messy. Thank you very much.